as the South Door and Organ project continues, our first phase of the Wren project at St. James's, there are all sorts of conversations that are coming to the surface and visitors of many kinds that are bringing this project to life afresh. And today, the person I'm having a conversation with has just over the last few minutes been inside St. James's and through the work in progress that is the South Door for the first time. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Ama Ofori-Darko. I'm an architect, soon-to-be architect, and photographer with a particular interest in the urban condition of churches within London's African and Caribbean communities. But yeah, just really happy to be here and to be a part of this conversation.
How did you start out in architecture, and how do those sacred spaces and the way that you interact with these kinds of communities, how did that really flow to the surface for you and become a really deep part of your vocation, if I can put it that way? What is it about those buildings, those communities, those places that is really precious to you and is something you want to share with people?
So I'm currently a Part 2 architectural assistant, which is not a very catchy title, but
you might want to explain what that means.
So I'm soon to be qualified, which means I've done my Part 1 undergraduate degree and my master's as well. And I think prior to beginning my master's, it definitely just felt like a profession and a job. And during my Part 2, it was suggested to me to study at the University of Cambridge, and I thought, what an amazing opportunity, but if I'm going to be there, I'd like to do something meaningful. I'd like to do a project that has value to me. And so I decided to explore the kind of spaces that I grew up in, which are kind of Pentecostal, African Pentecostal spaces, particularly in London. So these are kind of the spaces that formed my childhood, and I started having interest about them spatially because I knew it kind of experientially in terms of a worshipper or a family space, but the architectural eye that was being formed by my education, I started just a curiosity about where these spaces happen and how the spaces inform what happens there. And so, yeah, just looking at these spaces with a spatial lens, where they occur in the city, and they're often quite deeply woven into the margins and the peripheries. And I felt like I wanted to illuminate them and bring them out of those hidden spaces and share kind of the beauty that I've experienced in these vibrant and rich communities that have kind of operated independent of your traditional social, more formal social infrastructures. They're quite informal, independent, but thriving nonetheless. And yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. When I think of the words informal and independent, I tend not to think of the Church of England.
This is true.
And you are also connected with and I suppose journeying with, in some ways, accompanying aspects of the Church of England and its life now. And I'm wondering whether or not you might want to speak to that a little bit as we're in this precinct in the middle of London with a nearly 350-year-old, very much Church of England church right behind us.
So yes, after growing up in those Pentecostal spaces, I sort of had a curiosity for what else was out there, and I started just visiting a bunch of different churches, and found myself in an Anglican gathering in Bank. So I currently attend Imprint Church, which is the Bank Parish Church, and we worship in some gorgeous buildings. Like, we're very spoiled.
And they're Christopher Wren as well.
One is Wren, one is Hawksmoor. Like, we are spoiled. And so I worship there currently, and as an architect, I'm like fangirling every week, walking into these buildings, you know, people I've studied, like they're
Hawksmoor. And that's so interesting because you're watching that building come alive in worship.
Absolutely.
Aware of its layers of history and also aware of the limitations of that architecture and its history in relation to the kind of worship that might bring communities to life now. And that in that sense, I mean, I think a lot about contested heritage and about spaces that tell stories honestly.
Yeah.
When we go back to those layers of history and the way that that connects to your church experience here, to this church here, this architecture is gorgeous. And this architecture is also connected to a past as well as a present in Britain, which is constantly in need of, I would say, better conversations, bigger dialogues. What do you think?
So it's super interesting because St Mary Warnoth, which is the Hawksmoor Church, John Newton was a rector there for 27 years, and he is probably best known for his authorship of the hymn Amazing Grace, but his wider sort of context of his life was that he was a slave trader and owner turned abolitionist after encountering Christ, and that sort of radically reimagined his view on the slave trade. And I think he's better known as an abolitionist now, which is lovely.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, where it's like, I suppose this is how a lot of the people who gather around his moment in that past moment and his legacies now, that is how, quite frankly, speaking as a white woman and as an Anglican, that's how a lot of white Anglicans enjoy remembering him. And then they leave it at that because it's easier, I can put it as frankly as that. It's just easier, but it's insufficient, right?
Yeah, and I think, so we have kind of monuments to him in the church. He was a rector there for 27 years, so completely understandable. And they sort of reference the whole trajectory of his life. Speaking to the contested heritage, I think as a church, admittedly, there is an acknowledgement of the full trajectory. We don't just sort of focus on the end couple of years, which are easier to deal with. So I think that is to be commended. I feel like as Christians, we kind of miss out on an opportunity to really express a Christ-likeness when we skim over these difficult subjects. The whole concept of salvation is based on forgiveness and grace and reconciliation, but they can only be exercised in the acknowledgement of a wrong that's been done. And so we kind of rob ourselves as a body of the opportunity to really show what Christ's love means when we don't fully acknowledge the full scope of this conversation. So it's easier, but like, I don't know, high risk, high reward. Like you're missing out on such an opportunity to be who it is we're supposed to be, like who we're called to be when we don't do that. So yeah, I would implore us as a body to like not try and brush this stuff under the carpet, because let's like revel in these beautiful virtues that the Lord has shared with us and bring everyone else into that. I think the conversation of contested heritage as a whole within the Church of England, I think 2022, the Contested Heritage Committee was set up. Great step, I think. Better late than never.
Well, yes, I suppose. Exactly.
Like quite
Someone
recent.
described it as going from like negative 5,000 to negative 750, when really
a win is a win.
Interesting. And I'm curious about that too. So like I'm not sure if you've met her before, if you know the work that she does around this area, but Bishop Rosemary Mallett, who is a Black woman, she's Bishop of Croydon, and she came here to preach the day that we honored Kwabena Adabakugwano for the 250th anniversary of his baptism here as a teenager, and the way that she chose to speak about the ongoing constant pressures of the reality of the limitations of the thing, where it's like this work is just not done. Opening the conversation isn't having it, it's starting it, and even that is really, really difficult in itself. There's such a deep discomfort in wanting to start. And then I would say for a lot of the folks that I speak to, there's an even deeper, very raw discomfort in recognizing that it's not going to be quick and it's going to be costly, and it will, in the best but also in the worst possible way. I like this, high risk, high reward. It will mess with you. It will undo you. It will undo me. And personally, I think, well, thank God, because that's what God is there for.
Mm-hmm.
We have no examples, at least not that I can think of, of people of faith who have not been undone by the shock of having to confront what they have done, if I can, sort of look at it in that way. Yeah. And so I'm always interested to hear perspectives like yours, perspectives like hers, because we can't leave the past in the past. At least that's my view. And when we were in church earlier, we were also looking at these paintings by Che Lovelace, and you shared your first impressions. So I'm curious now, in this conversation, what are those impressions? What are your thoughts, your feelings, your imaginings as an architect and as your full self, as a person of faith, in relation to that project and in relation to the sacred space of St. James's as a whole, as a place where, I hope, people are going to be uncomfortable a lot, as well as beloved and cherished?
Yeah, I think discomfort is kind of a part of life. So if you're not, I hate to be the bearer of bad news.
Yes, exactly. Welcome to human existence.
But there are going to be times where I'm uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable, are you really living? Like, I do think British culture, we do tend to prefer resting in like this space of surface pleasantries and sort of hoping that will be enough. But the complexity and the depth of the human condition demands that we dig deeper than that. And again, like the church, the essence of spirituality deals with the very essence of humanity and being and who we are. And so, as you say, the scriptures is filled with people who were brought to the end of themselves, to discomfort, to questioning who they really are, having their very identities questioned and changed at times as well, for the better, actually, in almost every instance, but only after a wrestle with God. And so I don't really know what to say to people who are trying to avoid this. You kind of can't. It's inevitable and unavoidable. And it's kind of like if you have a sickness that you kind of ignore, it's not going away. And it's probably going to do you better if you address it. The earlier you address it, the better it's going to be for all of us. So, yeah, sorry. Is my answer to the question.
Yeah. And you were talking about the surprise at the burst of color in these paintings, and you said something about the relationship between color and architecture.
Yes.
And I'm curious about bringing that into the folds of this wider, richer conversation about what it is to be a human who desires change and yet is also kind of I would say like fearful of and drawn towards the wrestling, even in these strange experiences of these bursts of color that leap off the walls of this building and the practice of architecture as you have noticed it and experienced it. What do you think?
So when I first saw the paintings, I think the palette of most churches and most architecture really is quite muted, and that's not a critique, because I think my tastes have kind of been formed by my education as well, in that I do think there's a beauty to the subtlety and that kind of thing, but seeing those bursts of colours within the context of such a muted palette, traditional palette in the church as well, I think is a really beautiful juxtaposition. Kwabena was obviously from Ghana as well, like myself, and I know that culture to be super vibrant and lively, and so I think those paintings really capture that, which I think is beautiful. I think, sometimes navigating the UK as a diaspora, and there are times where you feel like you have to mute yourself a little bit. But it's nice to see that Che, the artist, hasn't sought to do that. He's fully expressing the identity of the person we're talking about. unashamedly, unapologetically. And I think we're all better for that. Sometimes you think you mute yourself and it will make it easier for everyone, but you actually rob people of encountering that richness. So yeah, I think that's what jumped out to me with those paintings.
And you're part of a global network of Black architects and also designers and people who are involved in the built environment. And that's a role that you had professionally a little while ago, and you're still a member of that network, right? So if you imagine there are about 500 of them, right? If you imagine bringing 500 of them, I really want to do this. That's more or less the capacity of this church. Okay. If you got around 500
we can
people.
make it happen.
So you imagine, you bring them here, you are the host. You run that event. This place is yours. What would that be like? What would you want to do? I'm springing this on you as a question, but imagine that global community. They are here. They are in this space. This space is holy. This space is complicated. What do you feel like doing with them? What would that be like?
I think that part of the value of the network is that there's an acknowledgement in the power of congregation as an act in itself. And so we're kind of a global network. So we're disparate across the planet. Most of our interaction is done online. And the times that we do come together are kind of sometimes in pockets, schedules. Not everyone can attend at the same time zones, exactly. So I think wherever we were, if we were all together in one space, that in itself is such a powerful and beautiful statement. And I think that's partially one of my learnings from the study of the spaces that I've grown up in. They find themselves in all sorts of typologies of buildings, places in the city, but the common thread is that we are together. Ultimately, that's where the value lies. And that's what makes it sacred ground, almost. The Bible talks about where 2 or 3 are gathered. It's the act of congregation that makes it special and sacred. And so, I think bringing us together in this space, thanks for the venue. I guess, hypothetically speaking, thanks for that. I think...
Altar, candles, whatever you want. The bread and wine is present.
I think there would be an acknowledgement that we are in a Wren building who was obviously incredibly, I was in St. Paul's last week and just taking in this guy's sheer talent and genius. And, I think your kind of average day-to-day person inhabit the city and kind of we all have inherent sensibilities in the way we interact with architecture subconsciously, whether we're aware of it or not. But I guess having all these women who have been trained in a particular profession, they would be able to put language to the things that they're experiencing, to the things that Wren intended for people to experience and take in and see and not see and that kind of thing. So I think Wren would appreciate it, having people who really appreciate
Wren would learn something. Wren would be like, you tell me.
Yeah. I think his craft would be appreciated, but having all these women together anywhere would be special. Yeah.
When we were in the building earlier, we got up close to the Grinling-Gibbons Reredos and noticed that there's this gravity-defying lightness to it. But also that up close, it kind of looks like what it is. The materials are surprisingly roughly worked with in places. And yet there's this incredible elegance, the fantasy and the look of the lightness. And we also walked through what currently is a really messy hole in the wall. And that is a Christopher Wren design. He wanted, and he had, a south door there going down towards St. James's Square and Pall Mall and beyond. And in the 19th century, we were talking earlier about it being bricked up because there were so many people in this church that they were like, we just need a few more pews. And the idea of 19th century architects and church leaders being like, Christopher Wren, he's an interesting guy, but we just need a few more pews. So that's something to think about from an architect's point of view. but also that we are there today looking at these ancient, beautiful things that are expressions of craft that have been, I hope, handed down intergenerationally in many, many ways, and that are new and fresh for worshiping communities every day. We also just walked through a work in progress in a big way. And you met the bricklayers.
Yes.
And one of the things that we noticed is that Mark, who works for Fuller's, he has this trowel fused to his mother's cross around his neck, which I found very, very moving, and that he was willing to show it to us and talk to us about it. And as we were standing there on this messy threshold, wondering whether or not our black clothing was going to get dusty and dirty, surrounded by bricks, by chunks of Portland stone, as an architect, what is that like for you to have that encounter with the people, with the building, with this work in progress?
I think it's profound from a few different angles. Because a building, you have the built edifice, you have the built kind of edifice, the process of its making, and also its life once it's inhabited. And it's kind of, we had all of those happening at the same time. So you have the bricklayer and his working on the building, kind of challenging his own perspectives on life and faith. And there's obviously a presence of faith in his vocation, kind of that's symbolized in the jewelry that he was wearing. You also have how we bumped into the rector on the way in as well.
Yeah, Lucy.
And she was talking about how we've spoken about this for so long, how this door being opened, and so to finally see it happening is so profound. And then the kind of future intentions and the reasoning behind opening this door up, and that unlocking its relationship to the wider city, kind of all of these things simultaneously happening. It's just really exciting to encounter. I think as well, whilst I was doing my research at Cambridge, one of the ways that I would conceptualize the church kind of spatially and spiritually was, you know, the Lord talks a lot about the temple and the design of it, and his house is like important to him, you know? And I think transposing that thinking onto the city, I have always framed the church as like the Holy of Holies, and the typology of the parish church often sits within a court. And maybe that's the outer court, but I've always read the outer court as the city itself. And so that means the whole city is kind of encompassed in what we're doing here. And the intention is for the whole city to be welcome, and that it belongs to them as much as it belongs to us, you know?
Precisely. And it belongs to the people.
Yeah.
We open it. The idea of church leaders, or as buildings and architects themselves, as somehow gatekeepers, is horrifying, because somehow that would make us potentially really impediments, living barriers to the connection between God and God's people. We have to, as much as we can, step into the discomfort of the prospect of taking that on unwittingly often, but it does happen. I think that's part of, you know, what we were speaking about earlier. And to recognize how we can widen these things out as best as we possibly can. By way of conclusion, I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share today.
Just that I'd love to be back once the works are done.
Yeah. Oh, there's going to be a party. You are invited.
Yeah, and
for sure.
Yeah, it's exciting to see the restoration of the organ as well, in progress as well. We were speaking earlier about kind of the relationship between ecclesiastical music and architecture, and I think just to see the south door being opened and the organ being restored, that recipe of architecture and music together, I think is really exciting, because in other churches I've been to, we were speaking about the church I attend in Bank, St. Edmund's, the other Wren church. It's quite stoic on the street as it sits there. It doesn't have a court the way St. James's does. It sort of sits in the streetscape, quite authoritative in its presence and its scale. And so it demands attention as you walk past it, like tourists will kind of peer in here and there. But on a Sunday when the doors are open, the music from our worship kind of spills out into the street. And so you get more tourists on that day, and they sort of come in, and you see them, it happens almost every week, you see them sort of gathered. Curious.
The boundaries are blurred through the
Absolutely.
sound.
And like the kind of initial stoic impression of the church gets softened by the music. And it's amazing because you literally have this dynamic where we'll be kind of in worship carrying on in the service, and you look back over to the tourists and one or two of them will be crying or weeping. And I think it's just that idea that whilst the worship is going on, it creates almost this tangible atmosphere that has obviously a super visceral effect on people. And yeah, so it's really exciting to see you guys kind of unlocking those two aspects of the church. And yeah, I'm excited to see the impact it will have on the relationship you have to people around the city as well as in the church.
Thank you for being with us today.
No
I'm so
worries.
grateful for your insights and for all you've shared.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you.